Hello, my name is Anand. Welcome to day 5 of the Department of Dreams, and to all the dads, happy Father's Day. I am really excited to welcome you to the Night of Takeover. It's for families. I am really excited to tune in. I hope you are as excited as I am. Nikki Massey and Immy Massey are going to tell you more about the action-packed schedule and where you can buy books from. It's called the Round Table Books. Me and my little brother Jeevan, we even loved nights on bikes. We even dressed up as knights and rode our bikes in the Birmingham when we met the author Gabriella. I am really excited to hear from Dapper and all the speakers today. Have fun. Here is Immy and Nikki Massey to tell you more. Bye bye.
Wow, what a wonderful introduction for today's takeover. Thank you, Jeevan and Anand. That was so lovely, and it was so good to have you. And I'm so glad you mentioned Gabrielle, because you obviously really enjoyed that event. Hi everyone, I am Nikki from Civic Square. To say I'm excited to introduce this morning's segment is a bit of an understatement. For those of you who've been following our work for a number of years now will know that books and reading have kind of showcased quite highly in our programming. And today we are just absolutely delighted to have Nights of doing the takeover. Today we've got the fabulous Amy Falone, who's one of the co-founders and co-directors of Nights Of. For those of you who are familiar with Nights Of, fantastic. And for those of you who don't know who Nights Of are, they are a teeny tiny but very mighty, very new independent publisher, which was set up about 3 years ago. The Nights Of was set up by Amy Falone and David Stevens, and the reason they set it up was because they wanted to work in an industry which reflected them, which reflected the world around them, and they could see that was not being represented in the traditional publishing industry. So in 2017, because they couldn't see a publishing house like that, they set one up. So to quote Amy, Nights Of was born out of a frustration with the lack of representative voices and narratives in children's fiction. With Nights Of, they can publish uniquely, they can put their differences aside first and celebrate them, making it central to their business. Since their establishment, I shouldn't use the word establishment, it's the wrong word, but since they were first set up, Nights Of have had some glorious days. They've published the fantastic High Rise by Shana Jackson. They've published books by Jason Reynolds and the Run series. And Anand and Jeevan already alluded to Gabrielle Kent's Nights Of, which I believe she's got a third book coming out next month. And then since then, Nights Of have published 13 books, the most recent of which being A Kind of Spark by Ellie McNichol. How many children's books are you aware of that actually give you an authentic autistic voice? I'm just going to read a tweet that Ellie recently shared. I got my 11-year-old autistic daughter your book for her birthday. It's the first fiction book she has read by choice. She cried after reading the first chapter. She said she felt like she was reading about herself and she felt like a superhero. Now, if that isn't something to tell you why we need a publisher like Nights Of, I don't know what we need. Nights Of have also set up their own bookshop in Brixton called Round Table Books. It started off as a pop-up, but then they soon realised this needs to be permanent. So we are featuring some of their books. If you pop to the left side of your screen, you'll see an expo, and in the expo there'll be a direct link to Roundtable Books, and where you can buy not only the books by some of the writers we're featuring today and illustrators, but some other books as well. Nights Of, they haven't had all glorious days. At the beginning of the pandemic, they were facing the very real reality of closing down, and they partnered up with Jacaranda Books, who publish inclusive books for adults, and spread the word, and they launched the Inclusive Indies campaign. And I'm really pleased to say it was successful, but don't think, like a dog is just for Christmas. Books are not just there for moments of crises. Books are there for all year round. So please do carry on supporting Nights Of and the many other independents who are out there. I'm going to hand over now to Amy Falone, who has curated a beautiful morning of talks for us. Before Amy kicks off, our first speaker, Immy's just going to say a few words.
Hi everyone, thanks so much and welcome to Amy. And also, I've only come on because Nikki will never big herself up, and I just want to say a huge well done to Nikki and Amy for putting this together, but also to say that Nikki's work spans all year round in creating incredible book and author events, and she was pivotal in putting together the event we did with Nights Of a couple of years ago. And so I just want to say, like, make sure if you're inspired by today, follow Nights Of, get books from Roundtable Books, but also follow along at Civic Square, because Nikki will be putting loads and loads of great events together for families, for children. And also she loves taking suggestions, right? So if you're really inspired by today and you're thinking, oh, I'd really love this, or I'd really love to do that, please let us know, because that's what we're here for. That's what part of our work is for. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the absolutely wicked Amy Falone. If you don't follow her online, make sure you do. Literally every day on Twitter, she's just a total joy. Even when she was in the middle of that massive campaign to raise money, read the articles, look at the pictures from Roundtable that just make your day. Absolutely gorgeous. They're so beautiful. So big up Amy, and have a great morning with Nights Of. We're absolutely thrilled to have them here as part of the Department of Dreams. Loads of love. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Immy. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to Anand and Jeevan. And if they are available to introduce absolutely every single event, I would like to sign up for that. And also a massive thank you to Nikki as well, who reached out. This morning, we've got an amazing lineup for you, for all the young people in your life. And we're starting first off with Alexandra Sheppard, who is the writer of Oh My Gods. Alex is a young adult author based in London, based in North London, actually. And her debut novel, Oh My Gods, was published by Scholastic in January of last year. Okay, over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Amy. I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to this. The lineup so far has been incredible, and I'm really honoured to be part of this amazing festival. It's my first virtual festival. Usually I'm used to seeing the faces of the people I'm talking to. So this is quite new for me. So if you do have any comments or any answers to the questions I'm going to ask, please do leave them in the chat, so I feel more like I'm speaking to lots of people rather than a screen. So as Amy said, my name is Alexandra Sheppard. I'm the author of Oh My Gods. It's my debut YA novel, so it means it's my first book. And I'm super excited to finally be able to hold it in my hands, because it took a long time to write. It took me 5 years. I don't know if you've ever worked on something for 5 years, but that's a really long time in any situation. So it's really exciting to be able to hold it and be able to speak to people about it at festivals like this. Before I go into my inspirations for the book, I wanted to talk a little bit about you guys. So you can answer these questions to yourself. Maybe if you're with a friend or a sibling, you can talk to them. Does anyone here live in a big city, like maybe London or Birmingham? That's question number one. Does anyone here sometimes struggle to turn in their homework on time? Maybe it's French, or it's maths or geography. That's question number two. And question number three, does anyone here have a really annoying older brother or sister? When I do that question at school events, that last one usually has loads of hands up. So if you answered yes to any of those questions, then you have quite a lot in common with Helen. Helen Thomas is the main character of my book, Oh My Gods. You can see her there. Helen is 14. She lives in North London, and she definitely struggles to turn in her French homework on time. It's like the bane of her life. So in many ways, she's a normal teenager. But one thing you might not have in common with Helen is the fact that she's half Greek goddess. Her dad is Zeus, king of the gods, and her big sister is Aphrodite, goddess of beauty. So while Helen might seem like a normal teenager, she has a problem of Olympic proportions on her hands, because half of her family are Greek gods in disguise, and that's a secret that she has to keep. So if you think your dad is annoying, or if you think your older sister is annoying, try having the goddess of beauty, for example, as your older sister, and then life suddenly gets much more difficult. So as you can tell, Greek mythology is a huge influence on my book. I don't know how much you guys know about Greek mythology, but whenever I do school visits, someone can at least say one fact. And I think that's really interesting. that thousands of years later, we are still talking about these myths. I can say that Zeus is the god of thunder, for example, and people would know that. I could say that Eros is the god of love, and people would know that. And I think it's super interesting that thousands of years later, we're still talking about these stories. And I think part of that is because of the way they're still a big part of the film and TV shows and books that we still read today. I read Percy Jackson growing up quite a lot, and I loved Percy Jackson. And I bet a few of you already know about Percy Jackson. You might have seen the film, you might have read the books, and that's about a boy who is half Greek god as well. And that really inspired me. Some of you might have seen Hercules and the Disney movie Hercules. It's on Disney Plus right now. I was obsessed with it when it came out at the cinema when I was 8 years old. I think I made my dad see it twice. I loved it. And seeing that film when I was 8 definitely planted the seeds for a love of Greek mythology that is still here today. And it's not just our films and our TV shows and our books that are still impacted by Greek mythology. If I talk about Nike, a major shoe brand, right? You all know the logo, but what you might not know is it's named after the Greek goddess of victory. So there's all these ways in that brands today, such as Hermes, such as the Starbucks logo, they're all influenced by Greek mythology. So it's still surrounding us. So it's no wonder that writers like me are still influenced by these stories today. You might have a favorite Greek mythology story. My personal favorite is the one about Persephone and Hades. It's a bit dark, but I think it's a really fantastic story worth reading into. And you might have done them at school as well, which is why you know about these stories. But they tend to linger. They're really, really powerful stories, and they're amazing inspirational material for writers like me. Another thing that influenced me when I was a teenager into writing was a book called The Princess Diaries. Again, came out when I was a teenager, so we're talking like, I think the first book's published 2001, so quite a long time ago. But I love this idea of a story about a girl who discovers that she's the princess of a small fictional country in Europe called Genovia. And I think that really influenced me later on in my story writing career, because I love this idea of a teenager discovering that they have a second life and this double life that they've got to manage alongside the normal difficulties of being a teenager. It's also very funny. I think the books are much better than the films personally, but the films are pretty good as well. So I often get asked about the research I had to do for this book. And in fact, I didn't want to do that much research. I kind of liked history at school, but when I wrote this book, I didn't want it to read like a history book. I didn't want to have people have to go to the British Museum or look at Wikipedia to understand what the gods I was talking about. I wanted it to be as accessible as possible, because I think books, above all, should be fun. I think books should be fun. I think they should be accessible. I think everyone should be able to enjoy them. So I didn't want to stuff it with loads of ancient Greek historical facts that normal people might not understand and young people might not understand. So I had to keep it as accessible as possible and not try and stuff it full of lots of facts to show off, because I don't want to show off. I don't want it to read like a history visit. I love museums as much as the next person. Yeah, they're fine for a day out, but they're not like as fun as going to the cinema or to the theatre or seeing a film. I wanted my book to be a fun experience, not feel like a museum visit. And one of the ways in which I made the book fun was thinking about the Greek gods and how they would be if they were on Earth today. So I already said Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, was a big character in the book. Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, huge figure in ancient Greek mythology. And one of the most fun tasks I had was thinking, what would Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, be doing if she lived in 21st century London? What would she be doing for a job? Would she be a makeup artist? Would she be a model? Would she be a beauty influencer? And I got to kind of think about that and think about how the goddess of beauty might be living in London today. In my book, I made her a makeup artist with a beauty influencer background, but she could have been so many things, right? She could have been an architect, a florist, an interior designer, just anyone who is into all things to do with beauty. Another big character in the book is Apollo, who's the god of music and god of the sun. And if you think about the god of music, huge figure in ancient Greek mythology, because music is a big part of every culture. But what would the god of music be doing in the 21st century? And for me, he could have been a busker, he could have been a recording artist, he could have been a rock star, he could have been a teacher. In my book, I decided to make him a DJ. So Apollo was a DJ in places like Ibiza, like summer holiday places, because he also loved the sun. And transforming these figures that have been around for thousands of years into characters into the book in a more modern setting was a super fun part of writing the book. And when I go to school visits, I always try and get the students to think about how they would turn these amazing gods who have got like superpowers and immortal life and what they would be doing in 21st century London. And that's a really, really fun creative writing exercise, by the way. If you ever get bored while in quarantine, think of a god or think of someone with a superpower. It might be Aphrodite, goddess of beauty. It might be Zeus, god of thunder. It might be Eros, god of love. Think about their powers and what would they be doing if they lived in your neighborhood or they came to your school for the day. That's a fun creative writing exercise if you're into creative writing. But of course, a lot has changed in the last few thousand years. We no longer worship these gods, and they're no longer a big part of our society in the same way, although the stories are. And while they're really, really entertaining stories for us that we can turn into films and TV shows, for the ancient Greeks, they had a much more important function. For the ancient Greeks, these myths and these gods really explained how the world works. And you might have some myths from your own culture. I'm Jamaican, and the myths that I kind of come from my culture are like Anansi, which come from West Africa, about the trickster spider. And Anansi gets into all sorts of hijinks. He makes all sorts of, he's quite mischievous and a trickster. But these stories explained how the world worked to the people of West Africa hundreds of years ago. And even though I don't believe that's how the world works, they still make for really, really fun stories. For the ancient Greeks, these myths explained how the world worked. So the fact that they believed in a sun god explained why the sun rose and set every day, which is something that they couldn't explain with science because they didn't have the science to explain. So I think that these myths and these stories exist for so long because they tap into some primal part of us that needs answers. Nowadays, we might have science or religion to explain these things, or science and religion. In those days, they had myths and a series of gods that explained how the world worked. And even though we don't believe in those gods anymore, we worship in different ways, we might all have different beliefs. There's something about these stories that really, really connects to each of us on a primal level. And I think that's why they're so popular thousands and thousands of years later. And the worship of these gods gives us an insight into what these people valued. I mentioned earlier about museums, and yes, you could go to the British Museum. I don't know if anyone has been to the British Museum, maybe on a school trip before. We certainly used to go all the time with our school trip. And you can walk around the museum and you see pottery shards or sculptures or bits of old jewelry that are thousands and thousands of years old. And through these artifacts, you can learn about these cultures and about these societies. But one really much more interesting way for me to learn about these societies is to read their stories, is to work out, read and listen to what they believed in. It might be through these stories that I learn way more about what this society valued than looking at some pottery shards, and in a much more interesting way. And that's a really powerful thing about stories, is that they can give us insight into so many different people and cultures around the world through time and through space. Through picking up a book or watching a film recreation, perhaps of like the Battle of Troy, for example, which is probably quite violent for some of you, but I can learn way more about what that culture valued than I can through going to an archaeological site or looking at a history museum. And I think it's much more interesting personally. Yeah, I think usually at this point I would ask everyone what their favourite Greek goddess or myths were, but I can't do that because of lack of audience interaction at the moment. So what I'd like you to do maybe is, if you don't have a favourite Greek god or goddess or a favourite myth, go away and research them. Spend some time maybe reading a book, or I'm not going to plug Oh My Gods because, as I said, I don't think you will learn much about the Greek gods through that. It's very, very light touch. But if you don't have a favourite Greek god or goddess, or from another myth, go away and research them. Have a look at these stories. Work out what their values are. And even though these stories might be super different to our own, you might find that they have quite a lot in common with stories we tell today, such as with comic books. Because if we look at the biggest film phenomenon of the last few years, Marvel Comics, aren't they superheroes? Superheroes are basically gods, right? They're superpowers, they have amazing powers, they are super powerful, and they often are very, very difficult to kill. So they're not quite immortal, but they are the modern equivalent of our Greek gods. So if you have a look at these stories, you might find out that there's a lot more in common than you think. And I think that's why the Greek gods are super, super fascinating to this day. And I hope to use a lot more of them in my future books. So if you haven't gone away and read about them or learned about them, then just pick one to learn about and see what it tells you about that society and what that group of people valued so many years ago. So that's it from me. I wonder if you guys have any questions.
I did have a question for you though, Alex, and that was, do you have a favourite Greek god? And if so, why?
I have a favourite god in my own book.
So,
Eros was my favourite, god of love. The Greek gods in Helen's family aren't always that nice, or they are quite dismissive of her as a half mortal. But Eros is the one who is actually quite kind to her and is a bit of a space of refuge in this whirlwind family. And I think having the power to control love is a super, super powerful thing, right? Like, he can cause a lot of trouble with that. And he always uses it responsibly. So he would be my favourite. But in terms of writing it, Aphrodite was the most fun to write because it's always more fun writing the villains.
I've got a question here from Layla. Shout out to Layla. What was your favourite part of writing Oh My Gods?
Definitely thinking about how the Greek gods would act in 21st century London. Taking these ancient gods like Aphrodite and Apollo and Athena and trying to work out what they would be doing for a job or for anything, for a hobby, what they'd be interested in, was the most fun part. Like making Aphrodite a makeup influencer, for example, with her own YouTube channel and her own beauty line was really fun, definitely.
Leon asked, can you tell us more about your main character and how she feels about her mixed identity?
Yeah, so Helen is half Jamaican. Her mum's Jamaican. And I think the biggest part, not only is Helen like having to live with a family of Greek gods, she's also moved from living with her Jamaican grandma to living with a family who are all white. And that must be really, really isolating for her. So it was really important that Helen's race figured in the book as much as her identity is like someone who is half Greek god but has no powers. And I think her feelings of alienation definitely contribute to how she moves through the world as a teenager. And part of the journey for Helen in the book is kind of finding space and peace in a world where she is not like anyone else.
We had a comment here, which was from Nikki, saying that we like Storm Zeus. They made up a storm name one day when they were in the car and it was really stormy.
Oh, yeah, Storm Zeus is perfect, right? Even though Zeus in my book is much more tame, but Storm Zeus, of course, Zeus would be stormy and thundery. I love that.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much for this amazing session. I know it's a little strange when you can't see everyone, but everyone is here sending loads of lovely comments and getting really engaged. Thank you so much, Alexandra.
Thank you for having me.